Going around, make sure to check that and let me know that you're here. Pastor Joe uses that more than I do, but he uses that for his calculations and measurements, whatever they're doing with that. In chapter 2, we enter into the section of Daniel 2 to 7, and I have a slide that says this, that is in Aramaic. Now, I use the word chiastic. Now, I explained that word last time. You may run into that because that word does show up in terminology that's in books and stuff for lay people. It's not just for the seminary scholars to talk to each other. So you may run into that term. And it just refers to a pairing or parallel, or inverted order, sometimes it's called. And it comes from a Greek word, from the chi, the letter chi in Greek. Just comes from that. And what a chiasm or a chiastic structure means is that you are pairing certain things together. And in the book of Daniel, and this is done largely in the ancients, they did it to help them remember things. We all use tricks to try to remember things. In fact, what church am I in? Do I know where I am? Yes. We try to remember things. They use this to do that, to remember. And Daniel 2 is paired with Daniel 7. They cover the same territory. Daniel 7 gives more information, as we'll see as we go into things. And then Daniel 3 and Daniel 6 are paired. You have Daniel's 3 friends are put into the fiery furnace. You have Daniel put into the lion's den. Okay, one under the Babylonians, one under the Persians. And it's a pairing of common idea. Okay, and then Daniel 4 and Daniel 5 go together, bringing low the first major king of Babylon. And Nebuchadnezzar was not the first major king. I mean, he wasn't the first king. He was the first major king, and we'll see in a minute that he was the greatest king of all time for Babylon. And then Daniel 5 is the bringing low the final king of Babylon, that's Belshazzar. And it's interesting, in a chiasm, the main point of the pairings is usually believed to be the middle section. And so that helps us to understand one of the themes of Daniel. One of the themes of Daniel is that God is bringing low the pride of the world kingdoms. He takes up, takes down. And we're going to see in chapter 2 a section that actually says that. Now, one of the things I didn't get to talk to you about last week was the whole issue of apocalyptic literature. We hear a lot about that today. Apocalyptic literature. Well, apocalyptic is a genre. It's a type of literature. And most of the time when you come to the Bible, you don't have pure genres of various types. You have mixed types. And that's true in Daniel. Daniel is not an apocalyptic book. It has elements of apocalyptic in it. So we would call Daniel a prophecy that has some apocalyptic elements in it. And we would say the same thing about the book of Revelation. It's prophecy, although it's an epistle. You heard the pastor in the first service. It's an epistle for the whole thing is an epistle, but then you got the 7 churches, epistles to them specifically. But it has elements of apocalyptic in it, and it's prophecy. So what is apocalyptic literature? It's symbolic and visionary language is an element of that. I've tried to underline the terms that you want to. Okay, I got off the beaten path with my arrow here. It's composed during oppressive conditions. In Daniel, they're certainly oppressed, right? They're captive, sent off to Babylon. In the same way with, if you look at the book of Revelation, John is in exile. In oppressive conditions. Visions are recorded exactly as seen. It's almost like somebody is rolling a camera and taking a picture of the words. Okay. By the way, this computer is not my computer, so I'm not used to it. Visions are explained through a divine interpreter. And we see that happening a lot in the book of Revelation, and it happens in Daniel 7 through 12 quite a bit. And there are those 4 visions that Daniel has. And then the theological content takes you to the end times. It has stuff before that, but it takes you to the end times. And certainly Daniel takes us all the way to the resurrection and the establishment of the kingdom in several different ways throughout the book. Then the 2 main parts to the chapter. You have the dream of Nebuchadnezzar, and there is no angelic interpreter. It's Daniel. God gives Daniel the interpretation, as we'll see that. For the rest of the chapter, from 17 to 49, interpretation of the dream. And I like to say it this way. Sometimes I say interpretation of the dream by Daniel. That's not what Daniel says. Daniel says the interpretation of the dream by God through Daniel. Okay? And that's an important point in the text, because Daniel certainly gives God the credit for that. Now let's get our Bibles and open them, and let's get into Daniel chapter 2. And by the way, if we don't finish, don't worry about it. We'll pick up and finish it next week, because chapter 2 is a very long chapter. Someone said, in fact, in my homiletic class, my first homiletics class in seminary, there was a guy there, and his students all made comments, gave evaluation forms, and one guy turned in and says, "You sure talk fast for somebody from Alabama." Okay, well, I'll try to talk fast, but I hope it's slow enough that you can catch things. Okay, the timing is in the 2nd year of Nebuchadnezzar's reign. If you look at chapter 2, verse 1, in the 2nd year of the reign of Nebuchadnezzar, he had dreams. Now, where is Nebuchadnezzar in the timeline? I've listed up here from his time onward all the different kings of Babylon until you have at the end Nabonidus and Belshazzar. We'll talk about that down at the end. Comes into there and goes till about 539, 536, that range of time. But in 606 is when Nebuchadnezzar starts. So 605, roughly 605 is when this takes place, BC. And of course, Daniel, remember, in chapter 1 is taken captive in that first deportation. And so Daniel has been in Babylon how long? 1 year. And remember, he was in a 3-year indoctrination program. And so he's 1/3 of the way through, okay, when this happens. Kind of get your settings. Note, I need to go back even further. Okay, you notice what's a problem to some people. In verses 1 and 2, it talks about dreams. Nebuchadnezzar had dreams. His spirit was troubled, and his sleep left him. So he had a troubled dreams. But notice in verse 3, the king said to them, "I had a dream," it's singular, "and my spirit is troubled to know the dream." So some people look at that and say, well, does the Bible contradict itself? No. The expression, his spirit was troubled, that he had dreams, is simply saying that Nebuchadnezzar had trouble sleeping because he was dreaming. It's just a way of saying that. So it's not a contradiction. Yeah, I had some dreams. Yeah, I had this dream particularly. And I know we all have strange dreams at times, don't we? And one of the strangest dreams I had, I was a little boy. I'm going to tell this story too, just have to. Okay, and I don't know why I had this dream. I had a lot of dreams about tornadoes, but this is not a tornado dream, okay? The Wizard of Oz really messed me up in those early days when I was a little boy, okay. But I was a little boy and I had this dream, and I was in a long line of people going over a small hill, and I didn't know where we were going. And so in the dream, I was always bothered, but where are we going? And I got over to the top of the hill, and then I saw the long line went down to a boat in a river, and there was a giant lady about 50 feet tall standing in the water, and as people were getting on the boat, she picked them up and ate them. I don't know what I was watching on TV to make that happen, but when I got down there and I was next on the boat, and I woke up. We all have strange dreams, and this was a dream. Now, I'm sure that dream was not from God. Okay, that was probably pizza or something. Okay, but this dream that troubled Nebuchadnezzar is from God. He doesn't know it. You'll find out where it's from as we go along. This thing goes real fast. Okay, notice as a result of the dream in verse 2, it says he commanded magicians, enchanters, sorcerers, and the Chaldeans to come to tell him his dreams. Now, I put in your notes there, I don't want you to copy all this down. I underlined the word or the words I want you to put down. The magicians were engravers. They did hieroglyphics. And they were from the priesthood. So they were close to what in the New Testament times among the Jews we would call the scribes. Okay. The enchanters, one who blows, breathes, or whispers incantations for conjuring spirits. Put down the word conjurer. It's very close, but not quite the same word as sorcerers, one who invokes supernatural powers, communicates with the dead. Now, what do we call that today? What's the most common word we use? One who communicates with the dead, does seances. Call him a medium. Okay, that's the number one word we use. Or crazy, one or the other. Okay. And then the Chaldeans, that's a priestly caste, and they are the aristocracy of the Babylonians, the empire. And they were custodians of the Babylonian mysteries and students of the sciences, including, and of course to us it's not a science, but to them it was, astrology. And I hope I didn't offend anybody that reads your horoscope every day. Notice that the Aramaic section begins in verse 4. Then the Chaldeans said to the king in Aramaic, O king, live forever. Tell your servants the dream, and we will show the interpretation. And of course, that Aramaic section goes all the way to the end of chapter 7. And we suggested last time that the Aramaic section also emphasizes a theme, and that is God in this section from 2 to 7 is going to deal with the world events from the vantage point of the world kingdoms. Okay? But it begins to move more and more toward God's view of things as we go along. Now, God's view is in here, but he's dealing with it from their perspective to a large degree. Now, in verses 5 through 12, Nebuchadnezzar shares his desire. He wants both the dream and the interpretation of the dream told to him. Now, he's pretty strong about that as you read the text. And that would be hard, wouldn't it? I mean, because if he gave a dream, if he shared the dream with them, they could do what? Make up anything they want as the interpretation, just make it sound good. And the whole text almost reads as if Nebuchadnezzar has some already preconceived skepticism about his wise men. Okay? The wise men he had called, I call him the A-team, because he doesn't bring all the wise men. It's the A-team, whoever the first stringers are. He calls them in. Because Daniel hears about it from somewhere else, and he's one of the wise men. So he's in the training program. So the wise men he had called claimed that knowing the dream is difficult or impossible, only the gods can tell. That's what he says in verse 10. And he accuses them of lying, by the way. The Chaldean said, there's not a man on earth who can meet the king's demand. They were wrong, as we find out. For no great and powerful king has asked such a thing of any magician or enchanter or Chaldean. Note the anger and the cruelty of the king. Verse 5, he says to the Chaldeans, the word for me is firm. If you do not make known to me the dream and its interpretation, you shall be torn limb from limb, and your houses shall be laid in ruins. Nebuchadnezzar must be a nice guy. You know, sometimes in our modern liberals will come to texts like this and say, that can't possibly be true. You know, our United States presidents, no matter how much we dislike them, and we dislike them all, don't tear people limb from limb. But he threatened to do that, and that's something he could do. Just with a word. Tell his guard, tell his soldiers, and it would happen. That seems kind of cruel. But you know, we talked last time about how cruel the Assyrians were. And the ancients are cruel, and you know, cruelty is still present in this world. It's still present all over the world. And there are people dying because of their religious beliefs. Some say 160,000 Christians die every year because they are Christians throughout the world. The Jewish people are attacked throughout the world. And other wars, and there's fighting going on, and there is cruelty in those wars. And I'm concerned right now what's going on in Ukraine. So, look at verse 12. Because of this, the king was angry and very furious and commanded that all the wise men of Babylon be destroyed. So apparently, I read this and I say Nebuchadnezzar has a temper. And he reacts immediately and very strongly toward the wise men who are begging him to give the dream so they can make something up. But he calls their bluff. And Daniel and his friends are included in the command to kill all the wise men of Babylon. Verse 13. And I take it this is probably a formal kind of thing. They're going to bring them all in for a formal execution. They're not just going to go to their huts or wherever they are and just kill them. I think he wants to make a spectacle, public spectacle out of this. Once again, Daniel makes a creative response. Remember how in chapter 1 about the food? He didn't want to eat the king's food because it wasn't kosher. The poor guy just wanted to eat vegetables. I know, right away, that's always given me some doubts about Daniel. But he wanted to do that and not eat the king's meat. But that would cause problems for his overtaker, the eunuch that was in charge of that group, because he would answer to the king if they came and looked emaciated before the king. And so, but Daniel gave a creative response. I said, listen, test us for 10 days and see how we do. And they did great. They did better than the others. So there was no issue there. And they rose up in the eyes of the king even. But here he makes this creative response. In verse 14, then Daniel replied with prudence and discretion to Arioch, the captain of the king's guard, who had gone out to kill the wise men of Babylon. He declared to Arioch, the king's captain, why is the decree of the king so urgent? Then Arioch made the matter known to Daniel. And Daniel went in and requested the king to appoint him a time that he might show the interpretation to the king. Daniel basically says, I can do this. Now look at go back to chapter 1, verse 17. As for these 4 youths, who's Daniel, God gave them learning and skill in all literature and wisdom, and Daniel had understanding in all visions and dreams. So in that the first year of the indoctrinational program that he had under the Babylonians, his skill and his ability to interpret dreams, to tell dreams and interpret them, that's something that he had already proven, or it was becoming obvious. Okay, and so he had that to fall back on. Now, not all the Babylonians knew it, and apparently King Nebuchadnezzar didn't know it. And so Daniel had some substance to back up his faith. It just wasn't a blind leap. And so he goes and makes this creative alternative under faith. And then we come to the interpretation section of the book of Daniel. God reveals the dream to Daniel. Daniel reveals the dream to Nebuchadnezzar. And then there's the promotion of Daniel and his friends at the end. Those are the 3 sections. Let's kind of go through those. Okay, God reveals the dream to Daniel. First, there's a group prayer. Notice when Daniel comes back from the king, verse 17, then Daniel went to his house and made the matter known to Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, his companions, and told them to seek mercy from the God of heaven concerning this mystery, so that Daniel and his companions might not be destroyed with the rest of the wise men of Babylon. So what does he run to? He runs to his friends and says, we got to pray. We need to pray together. And that's what we need to do when we're in trouble, right? We need to get other people that we know, our friends, and pray. Sometimes we need to come together personally and pray. Small groups need to pray for each other and their needs. So there is the importance of group prayer that's highlighted here. And prayer is an important aspect of the book of Daniel. It's one of the sub-themes. In Daniel 6, he's going to be in the lion's den. Why? Because he's a man of prayer. Okay. All the way through. So it's an issue. Then in verse 19, we have a direct statement. God reveals the dream. Then the mystery was revealed to Daniel in a vision of the night, and then Daniel blessed the God of heaven. Now, right there, it doesn't give us the details of the dream that was given to Daniel by God, which is the same dream Nebuchadnezzar had. And it must be a dream that Nebuchadnezzar could easily remember. Do you ever dreams that you can remember? Like my dream of the lady standing in the river? Yeah, we have dreams sometimes that we can remember. Now, Daniel breaks out, and remember, they're in kind of probably still in their group prayer when he gets that. But notice in verse 20, Daniel begins a praise song. This is poetry. Now, in our ESV, it's kind of set off a little bit because it is poetry. A lot of translations do that for us. Listen to it, though. Blessed be the name of God forever and ever, to whom belong wisdom and might. He changes times and seasons, and notice this. He removes kings and sets up kings. He gives wisdom to the wise and knowledge to those who have understanding. He reveals deep and hidden things. He knows what is in the darkness, and the light dwells with him. Remember Psalm 139 from this morning if you're in the early service. To you, O God of my fathers, I give thanks and praise, for you have given me wisdom and might, and have now made known to me what we ask of you, for you have made known to us the king's matter. And remember, one of the themes of the book of Daniel is that God raises up kings and pulls them down. He is sovereign over history. He is sovereign over the progression of empires in history. And right here in the prayer, he acknowledges that as he talks to God, and God's also the one who reveals things. By the way, in that picture, which I stole off the internet, Daniel and his friends are, how do you characterize them? They are young. Sometimes our pictures of Daniel have him old, and of course, as later on, he is old. He is old in Daniel chapter 5. He is old in some of those later visions. He's an older man in the period of the Persians. But he's young in chapters 1 and 2. So I thought that was a good picture to illustrate that in a very honest way. Honest with the text. Now Daniel goes to Nebuchadnezzar, beginning verse 25, and notice that he begins by crediting God. Look in verse 25. And this is important. Then Arioch brought in Daniel before the king in haste, and thus said to him, I have found among the exiles from Judah a man who will make known to the king the interpretation. And the king declared to Daniel, whose name was Belteshazzar, are you able to make known to me the dream that I have seen and its interpretation? And Daniel's answer was, no. Notice how he says this. Daniel answered the king, said, no wise men, enchanters, magicians, or astrologers can show to the king the mystery that the king has asked, but there is a God in heaven who reveals mysteries, and he has made known to King Nebuchadnezzar what will be in the latter days. I think that points ahead to end-time things. Your dream and the visions of your head as you lay in the bed are these. Okay, so Daniel credits God. In verse 30, but as for me, this mystery has been revealed to me not because of any wisdom that I have more than all the living, but in order that the interpretation may be known to the king and that you may know the thoughts of your mind. Daniel credits God, says, God just used me to do this. It's not really me. Now, if you notice the Bible never says anything bad about Daniel. You almost hate him over that. So many of the characters in the Bible, their negatives are out there, you know. There's Peter, foot in the mouth all the time. Okay. There's Moses and some of his weaknesses. Right? Just shows the weaknesses. The Bible's honest about it. But Daniel, not a thing bad is said about him. He must have been quite an interesting and wonderful follower of God here. So he takes no credit, gives it all to God. And that's what we should do. That's a good example for us. In the things that we do, God gives spiritual gifts to us. Okay? A teacher has no right to take credit for what God is doing through them. Servers have no right to take credit for what God is doing through them. Now, we thank each other, and that's great. But the bottom line is we should all point it back to God. And that's a good lesson that we can learn from Daniel. And then Daniel tells the dream. And the dream is this. He does that in the next few verses. Starting in verse 36. And what he has is this statue. Now, there are different ones, pictures of the statue, and you can get nice ones on the internet. This is a Friends of Israel one. I could get it without violating any copyright. The Friends of Israel gives me. But you see a head of gold, a chest of arms in silver. Now, the way the design is done on the top of the head, there's a beard there and all that, that's kind of given to how the Babylonians looked. Okay. Chest and arms of silver, middle and thighs of bronze, legs of iron, and at the bottom, feet of iron and clay. And then there's a stone that comes and crashes and destroys the statue. And that stone's probably not big enough, but it's the best I could do with the picture. Now, as he gets into the interpretation, verses 36 to 45, he tells him that the head of gold is you. Verse 38, it actually says that. At the end of verse 38, see that you, he's talking to Nebuchadnezzar, are the head of gold. So Nebuchadnezzar and his empire, the Babylonian Empire, that's the first part of the statue. We shouldn't have to debate that part, although some do. Luther struggled with this. He said, well, maybe it's Assyria. Maybe it's Babylon. But maybe it's Assyria. Okay, wait a minute. You are the head of gold. Who's he talking to? Nebuchadnezzar. So Babylon is the head of gold. We really shouldn't debate that one. Okay? Now, as we go on, there's some more debates perhaps, but let me just walk through what I believe. The chest and arms of silver, Medo-Persia. Chapter 5, it's the Medo-Persians who come in and destroy Babylon. They're next. And in 8 verse 20, chapter 8 verse 20, and we'll see it when we get there, it actually names the Medes and Persians in the vision of the ram, the goat, ram and the goat. It actually names them, okay? And then the middle and thighs of bronze, Greece is actually named also in chapter 8, verse 21, and it's pretty clearly alluded to in chapter 7 in the symbolism, plus also in the last vision of Daniel in chapter 10. So there's really, in my opinion, should be no debate about these three, Babylon, Medo-Persia, and Greece. They are actually clearly named within the book of Daniel. The one that's not clearly named in the book of Daniel is the fourth one, the legs of iron. I put Rome down. We know through our history books that the ones who conquered the Greeks were the Romans. And we don't have the Romans mentioned in the book of Daniel, except perhaps in an allusion in chapter 11, verse 30. It refers to the Kittim, and some translations will say that differently. Some will say that's Cyprus. Some will say that's western lands. Some translations will say Kittim. They'll just transliterate the Hebrew word there, or actually the Greek word from the Hebrew word. As it said even in Greece, probably a loan word, Kittim. Now, who are the Katoi, as they were called? Well, it's the name of a city and a region in southern Cyprus. That's why some translations have put Cyprus. Now, if you're standing on the western shore of the Mediterranean, you're looking out toward Cyprus, which way are you looking? Looking west. Later literature in the Apocrypha has Macedonia as the Kittim. Now, where's Macedonia? That's in Greece. Okay? And even there's some ancient literature, the Greek islands, which all of us would like to own one of those. Those islands are called the Kittim. But it's interesting, in the Greek translation of the Septuagint, that's the Jewish scholars from 250 to 150, we talked about that last week, who translated from Hebrew to Greek. In 11 verse 30, they took the word Kittim and they translated it Romans. They actually used the word. So I think there's really no alternative for us, we have to say, in light of history and in light of that connection to that word, because you're on the west, standing on the shore looking out, the people coming from the west, whether it's from Cyprus, a certain time in history, from the islands, Greek islands, from Macedonia and Greece, and for Rome. People come from the west. And of course, we know that Rome came in the 2nd century BC and began to take over that part of the world. I'm going to come back to the revived Rome idea there. Some issues in interpretation. We probably won't finish this, but we'll come back to it next time. The usual Maccabean theory approach to the four main kingdoms. Remember last week we talked about the two views of the date of Daniel. Some dated in the 6th century BC, that's us, the traditional view. It's written when it says it's written. But some, the liberals, hold 2nd century BC. So it's written, 150 BC. Why do they do that? They want to be in the Greek period. And so they do the four kingdoms a little bit differently. They have Babylon, Medes, Persians? Greece. Remember, their motivation for the late date is that they want to say everything is written after the fact because they don't believe in a supernatural God who can pre-write history. So if they can have it after the Greek period and not fool with the Romans here, for example, they can see all of this as some guy wrote after the fact but put the name Daniel on it to try to elevate himself. That's how they kind of viewed that. One of the problems they have with this scheme, they separate the Medes and Persians. You notice that? Book of Daniel doesn't separate them. You go to chapter 8, and Medes and Persians are put together. So this really isn't a helpful approach at all and just betrays the fact that they don't believe in the supernatural. And we do. We accept what the Bible's claims. And again, remember, we said there's a big problem to have all that written after the fact. The 70 weeks prophecy we'll get to in Daniel 9 goes to the time of Jesus, the first 69 weeks of that. Goes to the time of Jesus. And so, and we talked about how some, dated it after Jesus, the book of Daniel. Okay, but since he talked about the abomination of desolation, well, that means he had to, the book of Matthew had to be written before then, after then, and on it goes. So it's just not a good way to approach Bible study. Then it mentions in verse 39, and this is a conundrum of sorts. He says, after he tells Nebuchadnezzar, you are the head of gold, another kingdom inferior to you shall arise after you, and yet a third kingdom of bronze, etc. So there is a growing inferiority. And of course, that's betrayed by the elements, right? Gold, silver, bronze, iron and clay. As you go down through there, we'll deal more with the stuff at the end here in a minute, or next week. So you have a growing inferiority that the statue seems to say. Now, what does that mean? Does it mean that the empires themselves are smaller in history as you go along? And the answer to that's no. The Persian Empire was bigger than the Babylonian Empire. And the Greek Empire was probably slightly larger than the Persian Empire. Remember, Alexander the Great went all the way from Greece to India. Didn't last long, but it did all that. And the Romans, they didn't go all the way to India, but they went all the way to England the other way. So we can't say that it's an issue of territory. Some have suggested, and I think it's probably right, there's a moral aspect to this. That as the kingdoms of the world continue, there is moral decline. Some would say that in the realm of cruelty. Of course, the Romans were pretty benevolent until you cross them. And they were very, very cruel if you cross them. And so it's a hard question. Inferior in some way, God knows. He doesn't tell us there what that is. But most scholars say there's probably some moral aspect that's here. And certainly there's a somewhat of a decline in the ability of the dictator to control everything as you go down through history. But I think there's a moral aspect is the best thing that I've seen on this. Now there's this fifth kingdom. Verse 34 and 35, it's brought in by the stone crushing the statue. In fact, in England, during the time of the English Civil War, I'm sure y'all are up on your history on that. In the 17th century, in the 1600s, England had their Civil War a couple centuries before ours. You remember Oliver Cromwell and those kind of things. Okay. Well, during that time, there was a political party called the Fifth Monarchy Men. And they take their name from this. They're the Fifth Monarchy, the Fifth Kingdom, which they view as God's kingdom, and they're right about that. And they also were premillennial. Most of the English people were amillennial at that time, but they almost took over Parliament during the time of Oliver Cromwell. That was an issue. Very interesting read. But in politics, but the fifth monarchy men recognized the kingdom of God as the fifth kingdom. So did Oliver Cromwell and the other guys. That's crushing the statue. And notice the divine origin of this kingdom. Verse 34. As you looked, a stone was cut out by no human hand. This is not humanly devised. And then you come down to verse 44. And in the days of those kings, the God of heaven will set up a kingdom that shall never be destroyed. And it'll break to pieces. And verse 45, just as you saw that a stone was cut, and here it adds, from a mountain by no human hand, and that it broke in pieces the iron, the bronze, the clay, the silver, and the gold. So it brings to an end the progression of world kingdoms. That's how I take that. So it's divine origin. And it starts in the days of the kings of the feet and toes of the statue. Verse 44 says, and in the days of those kings, I take that as the immediate context, the iron mixed with clay. Okay? Now, we're out of time. So now we're going to have to talk about what did those guys at the very bottom of the statue, what's all that about? And we're going to ask the question, is this talking about the first advent of Jesus or the second advent of Jesus? And we'll have to wait till next week to find out. Okay, let's pray. Father, thank you so much for your word. Again, encourage us with your word and also warn us and help us to do better in our lives as we lead our lives in full confidence of you and what you've done and what you have told us. In Jesus' name, I pray. Amen. Thank you for coming. Thank you.
He's very efficient. He's stealing the computer. I got to start him.
Well, it's not my computer, it's his.
No, that's all right. He just came and grabbed it.
That's good.
He's efficient.
Yes. It doesn't bother me at least. I try to finish on time myself.
You did fine. You did fine. That's the biggest issue.